On the 1st of July, 1997, as planned, Prime Minister Tony Blair oversaw the handover of Hong Kong to the Chinese, representing the final nail in the coffin for any semblance of a British empire. The following month, tragedy struck the United Kingdom when Princess Diana, ex-wife to Prince Charles III, son of Elizabeth II, died suddenly in a car accident while abroad in Paris. Diana's cute demeanor and tinge of normalcy made her a favorite among the people of the Commonwealth, and her loss was deeply mourned. While her relationship with the public had been warm, her relationship with Charles III and the rest of the royal family had not. Early in their marriage, Diana and Charles III realized their incompatibility and both began to cheat on one another shortly after the birth of their two sons, Princes William and Harry. Diana had an affair with a lowly horse riding instructor, which angered and embarrassed Charles III. He responded in kind by having an affair with the couple's nanny. Diana had a paranoid streak, and back in 1995, she infamously expressed her detailed fears to her lawyer, Victor Mishcon, that Charles III was planning to kill her by staging a car accident that would either kill her outright or injure her enough that it would be easy to finish her off in a way that presented itself as a natural death. The letter, known colloquially as the Mishcon Note, is often overlooked when discussing the death of Diana today. Charles III would end up not having a long relationship with his nanny adulteress, and he would eventually settle down with his childhood sweetheart, Camilla Strand. So Diana had been visiting Paris with her new boyfriend, socialite Dodi Fayed, son of Mohammed Al Fayed, who once again somehow managed to thrust himself front and center into the cultural debate of Britain in the 1990s. The couple was staying at the Ritz Paris, which was a property owned by Al Fayed, on August 31st. The couple left the hotel along with their driver, Henry Paul, and their bodyguard, Trevor Reese Jones. Henry Paul had been drinking earlier that evening, and the sight of a large swarm of paparazzi wanting to snap a picture of Diana caused him to floor it and travel at a high speed through the city. As the car approached the Pont de Alma tunnel, a white Fiat Uno was merging onto the parkway and clipped by the car Paul was driving, caused it to spin out of control and hit one of the tunnel's support pillars, causing the vehicle to burst into flames, killing Diana, Fayed, and Paul. The Fiat Uno then quickly drove off, only leaving evidence due to the characteristic white paint chips which were left behind at the crash site. Right away, Al Fayed began accusing the royal family and MI6 of assassinating Princess Diana and collaterally his son as part of a large conspiracy to avoid the embarrassment of a royal being in a relationship with an Arab. Adding to the intrigue, the sole survivor, Trevor Reese Jones, had spent his career in the British Special Forces, the SAS, before retiring and transitioning into being a bodyguard. Conspiracy theorists, for some reason, often overlook Reese Jones and instead focus on Henry Paul, accusing him of potential ties to British intelligence. Further investigations actually believed and revealed Henry Paul was not a party to the British, but rather a long-standing informant for French intelligence, the DGSE. It is impossible to know what truly happened unless additional evidence is somehow released. In my assessment, the crash was an accident that was covered up due to uncomfortable truths that would emerge given greater inspection. I believe that British and French intelligence knew that Al Fayed was a member of Arab intelligence and a CIA collaborator, and that they were concerned that he was using his son as a way to insert himself into the royal family. Paul and Reese Jones were both employees of Al Fayed, and I believe they were actually French and British intelligence agents inserted into his operations to monitor his activity. Both countries had a strong interest in keeping these ties to intelligence hidden. Al Fayed, due to his long involvement in intelligence circles, knew how dark operations could be, and I believe his paranoia against the royal family was probably genuine. The reason it still appears to be an accident is that we almost certainly know who was driving the white Fiat Uno, with that being Lee Von Tan, a 22-year-old Vietnamese factory worker who was living in Paris, who was the son of first-generation immigrants. He had left the factory early that night to visit his father, who lived in the vicinity of the Pont de Alma tunnel. After the crash, he drove to his brother's house and woke him up from his sleep to help him spray paint his car red, since his brother was a mechanic. French intelligence were able to track him down and interview him, getting him to confess to being the driver at the scene. However, no charges were brought as Levanton was not at fault, but rather Henry Paul, who was drunkenly speeding. He was told not to speak to British authorities regarding their investigation that was opened into the matter, Operation Paget, as they warned him they may try to pin the blame on him. Al Fayed would spend the rest of his life promoting outlandish conspiracy theories surrounding the accident until his passing in 2023. After Al Fayed's death, it was revealed that within his sprawling Harrods department store, he oversaw widespread sexual assault and rape of female employees. New female employees were often forced to sleep with Al Fayed in order to secure their job. Elizabeth II did not help her tarnished image with the public following Diana's death either, and as she failed to have the British flag fly at half mast over Buckingham Palace. The Queen then caused further uproar in October when she visited the site of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in India, where she was greeted by throngs of Indian protesters chanting, "Go back, killer Queen." The massacre occurred back in 1919 when the British Indian Army opened fire on a crowd of protesters in Punjab in response to their opposition to the recently imposed Rowlatt Act, which would allow the army to more easily arrest citizens of British India if they were suspected of aiding anarchy or revolution. The anger surrounding the Elizabeth II's visit to the site of the massacre would come back to haunt her on Christmas Day in 2021 when 19-year-old Jaswant Singh Chahal broke into the Windsor Castle armed with a crossbow with the intent on killing the Queen. Thankfully, he was quickly apprehended before any harm could be caused, and he was institutionalized in a psych ward for homicidal behavior. The following year, Blair was able to accomplish the crowning achievement of his administration with the passage of the Good Friday Agreement, which largely brought the sectarian violence of the Troubles to a close after 30 long years by following a unique and groundbreaking structure. The treaty was split into three separate so-called strands, which each had its own objective. Strand 1 governed the internal relations of Northern Ireland by recognizing 7 new official political parties. 3 of these were designated as unionist in nature, being the traditional Ulster Unionist Party, the Progressive Unionist Party, a left-wing working class party, and the Ulster Democratic Party, representing the right-wing Ulsters, with the latter two parties being devolved from the Ulster paramilitary groups, the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Ulster Defence Association, respectively. 2 parties were designated as nationalist, with those being the Social Democratic and Labour Party, a moderate left-wing party that advocates for eventual unification with Ireland, and Sinn Féin, a more radical pro-Irish party being devolved from the IRA. Finally, there were 2 independent parties, being the Alliance Party, which actually advocates to reform the government created by the Good Friday Agreement into a sectarian system without regard for mandatory political representation. And finally, the short-lived Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, which promoted advancements in women's rights in Northern Ireland in the face of sectarianism. These parties would meet in the newly formed Northern Ireland Assembly, which included the aforementioned identity-based political mechanism known as cross-community voting, which required support from both unionist and nationalist parties for major decisions. Additionally, the Northern Ireland Executive was set up, which would serve as the executive branch, with ministerial positions allocated to the different political parties based on their proportional share of the legislature. Strand 2 covered relations north-south, relations between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland by creating a series of institutions, including the North-South Ministerial Council, which organized relations between the Northern Ireland Executive and the executive agencies of Ireland to encourage greater cooperation. This cooperation was extended to the legislative branch with the creation of the North-South Interparliamentary Association. Finally, Strand 3 covered East-West relations between Ireland and Great Britain by creating a series of institutions, including the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which replaced the Anglo-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which was created under Thatcher in favor of cooperation between the 2 physical islands rather than between 2 ethnicities. Next, the British-Irish Council was an executive branch cooperative agreement similar to the one created in Strand 2. It also included representation for the nearby British territories of the Isle of Man, Jersey, and Guernsey, so that they may have a say in regional matters. Finally, a cooperative institution was created for the legislative branches known as the British Irish Interparliamentary Body. The agreement then stipulated an organized prisoner release between the two sides and decommissioning of paramilitary groups with a normalization in relations. Not everyone was thrilled by this result, and in August, a large car bombing orchestrated by the real IRA, an even more radical offshoot of the Provos, occurred in the town of Omagh in Northern Ireland, killing 29 civilians, making it the deadliest event in all the Troubles. The indiscriminate horror of the bombing, which killed Catholics, Protestants, children, the elderly, pregnant mother, tourists, had a chilling effect on the island, serving as the event that finally made everyone agree that violence and death in this conflict is not a worthy tool for political reform, and the Good Friday Agreement was squarely followed after that. In reaction to the Omagh bombing, Blair passed the Criminal Justice Terrorism and Conspiracy Act of 1998, which allowed greater cross-jurisdictional prosecution for suspected terrorists. In addition, he passed the Human Rights Act of 1998, which brought the UK's human rights laws to be in line with those of the EU, and the National Minimum Wage Act of 1998, which created the first national minimum wage for the UK. That year, Blair also ordered the country's renowned universities to begin charging tuition fees to help cover rising costs. Blair had a good relationship with U.S. President Bill Clinton. In December, when Clinton asked Blair to assist in the joint bombing campaign against Iraq for their impeding of international weapons inspectors, he happily obliged. The last year of the millennium saw Blair pass the Immigration and Asylum Act of 1999, which created designated areas for temporary residence for migrants waiting for their visa application rather than general release into the public. The following year, Blair showed the world that British military muscle still did exist when he intervened in the Sierra Leone Civil War, a conflict in the former British colony which had been raging for 11 years, but launching Operation Palliser, which had the goal of sending British special forces into the country to support the government against revolutionaries supported by neighboring Liberia. By September, the British forces had largely secured the capital, and as part of a last gasp, the rebel group, the West Side Boys, captured a dozen UK soldiers of the Royal Irish Regiment and held them hostage. The British executed Operation Barras, which sent in the commandos to rescue the hostages and arrest a large number of the West Side Boys gang members, largely ending in conflict as this group was one of the last rebel holdouts. On the legislative front, Blair passed the Terrorism Act of 2000, which allowed the government to maintain lists of suspected or wanted terrorist groups and permits warrantless arrest for 48 hours for suspected terrorists. This was followed by the Anti-Terrorism Crime and Security Act of 2001, which was a wide-reaching draconian law allowing asset seizure or freezing of funds of suspected terrorists and made it illegal to possess WMDs and allowed police to more easily fingerprint citizens, marking the beginning of a dramatic decline in individual freedoms within the United Kingdom. Blair again came to the military assistance of the United States by launching Operation Herrick in response to the 9/11 attacks, which would end up sending 9,500 British soldiers to Afghanistan to hunt and dismember the Taliban. The British troops were deployed to the southern Helmand province, where the British had previously been roundly defeated in their earlier colonial excursions into Afghanistan. The British soldiers, oblivious to the history of the region, were not prepared for the level of hatred that the locals held for them, and they were resultingly under almost constant heavy attacks. Blair would go on to pass the Nationality, Immigration, and Asylum Act of 2002, which made it easier for British overseas nationals to become citizens, created required citizenship ceremonies, required English proficiency, and required the passing of the Life in the United Kingdom test, a quiz which covers the basics of British society. The Proceeds of Crime Act of 2002 allowed for the civil recovery of proceeds seized from anti-money laundering operations and created the Assets Recovery Agency to manage such proceeds. The Police Reform Act of 2002 created new roles for community support officers to handle less serious crimes and to avoid unnecessary escalations. The high probability of jury manipulation and decreased, or excuse me, The Criminal Justice Act of 2003 allowed judges to preside exclusively over cases when there is a high probability of jury manipulation and decreased prohibitions against double jeopardy when new and compelling evidence is introduced. Finally, the Railways and Safety Act of 2003, which created the Office of Rail and Road, which would oversee the new agencies of the Rail Accident Investigation Board and the British Transport Police. That year would also see Blair reinvade Iraq with the U.S., this time bringing 45,000 troops along. Blair was adamant that British intervention into the Iraq War to ensure Saddam Hussein did not possess WMDs, something of which the public was skeptical of. Their suspicions increased with the opening of the Hutton Inquiry, a parliamentary investigation following the mysterious death of a British weapons inspector named David Kelly after he became a whistleblower speaking out against the fake Iraqi WMD story. To this day, a vast majority of British citizens do not believe the official findings of the inquiry and insist Kelly was wrongfully punished for speaking the truth. The following year saw the passage of two landmark civil rights bills with the Civil Partnership Act of 2004, which allowed gay couples to enter into civil partnerships for the first time, which possessed all the same legal benefits of a marriage. This was followed by the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, which allowed people with gender dysphoria to change their sex. British society had a more progressive view towards transgender individuals at this time relative to other Western societies, due in large part to Julia Grant, who was a British trans person who agreed to have their life filmed for a BBC special in 1979. The documentary showed the painful details of Julia's life, from her falsely thinking she was gay to her being resented and ostracized by her friends that she formed in the gay community for actually wanting to transition into being a female, to being continued to the continued objections of her appointed psychologist against her desire for transitional surgery. Eventually, Julia would undergo the transition against her doctor's wishes and would enter into a relationship with a man who would eventually leave her following a painful complication which resulted in her no longer being able to have sex. The film ends with an older Julia remarking on how she thought the surgery and transition would finally make her feel good about herself. But in the end, it did not fix many of her problems. This complicated picture of gender dysmorphia or dysphoria garnered sympathy and understanding for the community. Blair would earn the title of honorary gay icon when he repealed Section 28 from the Local Government Act of 1988, which had specified local government entities could not do anything that may give the impression of promoting homosexuality. The next year, Blair passed the Serious Organized Crime and Police Act of 2005, which created the specially designated Serious Organized Crime Agency, and despite its name, was mostly to limit the organization of anti-war protests in the vicinity of Parliament. The Prevention of Terrorism Act of 2005 retroactively absolved the government of the illegal detention of 8 foreigners with suspected ties to terrorism that were detained without trial at the notorious H.M. Belmarsh prison, and then it made it easier to hold people without trial.